I first want to tell you who we are, who SEPA is, who I am, and why we're here at the New School for Social Research in the New School. My name is Teresa Ghilarducci, and I'm the director. I'm honored to be the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, and I'll tell you about Bernard Schwartz in a minute. The center has been part of the Department of Economics at the New School for many years. Why? Because the economists in the department believe fervently that our work must lift up the living standards of workers and of poor and marginalized people, that understanding the dynamics of capitalism is important for change. And without a way to lift up those analysis of capitalism and transmit this into policymaking, we aren't fulfilling our mission as a department. So SEPA is embedded in the economics department, and we are hoping to lead to the understanding of the economy and to make the world a much more progressive and equitable place. I want to also tell the folks here that we have an online audience. And online audience, thank you for being online. You might have your own work-life balance problems and couldn't get here. I'm glad the technology could help you out, though Heather will say that's not the answer. We need other answers. I will be asking for your questions at the end of the lecture, and cards are being passed out. So please take many cards and ask many questions. Now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. She is this year's Bernard Schwartz Speaker in Economics and Public Policy. Bernard Schwartz is a generous benefactor of the New School and of our center, and he wants to help our students and our faculty imagine what a president and Congress and leaders at all levels of government can do to make the world a much more progressive and equitable place. Heather and all of our speakers come in order to speak to that goal. She is now the executive director and chief economist at a center called the Center for Equitable Growth. She's also a senior fellow at a much older organization, the Center for American Progress. Her work focuses on U.S. labor market policy and has a lot to say about policy all around the world. She's especially concerned about the social wage and the policies that create the social wage and how it affects the labor market. She has testified in Congress many, many times, interacts with policymakers at the very highest levels. The New York Times has called Heather one of the most vibrant voices in the field, and Heather Boushey often testifies in many, many other areas, and that's where the New York Times lifted her up. Her research has been published also in academic journals. I'm actually talking to the students in the room as I'm saying these things, so the biography sort of matters to you all who are younger. So she testifies in Congress and also publishes academic work. As you'll see, this book, published by Harvard University Press, attests to the merger of policymaking and academic work. She has been, listen up you all who want to get jobs in the real world, she went to the Economic Policy Institute, fresh out of, guess where she got her degree? The New School for Social Research at at our university, at the New School. In our department, worked with Anwar Sheikh. Her first job was EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, a fantastic training ground for many progressive economists who found out everywhere. I'm executive director, on the executive board of EPI. From there, went to the Center for Economic Policy Research. We had one of the founders last week here speaking in our program. Was at the Joint Economic Committee as a staff economist, and she's also on the board of the Opportunity Institute. Heather, thank you for coming back home. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you so much. It's so great to see so many old friends and faces. I will note that actually one of my first jobs was that I was one of the first group of 3 scholars to work at what was then just called SEPA before Schwartz funded it. So I feel like I have a long history connected to, there we go, with this particular organization. So I'm especially delighted to be here. And I'm very much looking forward to Catherine's remarks after. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So, so allow me to just get started. So I'm going to move this down here because it's going to distract me. Oh, no, I'm not. So the motivation for this work is many of the things that Teresa talked about. That I have spent my time since I decided that I wanted to grow up and become an economist, trying to understand how it is that the economy can give us access to the kinds of jobs that people need in order to support the kinds of lives that they want to need. I mean, that they want to live. And ultimately, I became an economist because I was interested in family economic well-being and the role of the economy in making that possible. Because most of us get most of our income through having a job. So if you don't have a job, then that kind of constrains the rest of your life. And I've always been particularly interested in the role of policy in making that possible, in supporting people's abilities to have the kind of standard of living that they want to have. Over the past few decades now, as I've been struggling with these issues in a variety of different ways, one thing that has become really clear to me, and is the conclusion that I want to share with you today in this talk, is that we need to rethink the rules that govern the way that we bound how we buy and sell time in the labor market, which is why I called the book Finding Time, The Economics of Work-Life Conflict. That fundamentally we are living in a place where there's a mismatch between the policies that we have around how people can use their time, how they can buy it and sell it, and how we actually work and live. And this affects things that happen both inside firms and inside families. I think there are really stark and important implications for economics, for policy, and also for thinking about politics. In particular, I think that this issue of time and the time that families have lost underlies a lot of the frustrations that we see right now in our political, sort of the political climate that we're seeing playing out during this election. So I'll come back to that in the end, but I wanted to put a little pinpoint there that was one of the conclusions I'm heading towards. So the basic idea that we buy and sell time is, of course, fundamental to why we think that capitalism is different than other economic systems. You know, when we think about the transition from an earlier economic system where you might have had market economies, but it wasn't based on people going in every day and selling their time to someone for some sort of salary or wage, right? That's what we think sort of marks the transition from feudalism to capitalism, what makes the economy that we live in here very different. And with this new kind of economy where people were out there selling their time rather than selling a loaf of bread or selling some product, but actually selling our time to some employer, we saw very quickly, as soon as you saw the economy starting to industrialize, you saw labor movements starting up to find ways to bound that time, right? You had, of course, in the early part of industrialization, people working these extremely long hours, putting in 10, 12, 14, 16-hour days. And very quickly you saw movements rise up to say, this isn't humane. We don't want to be living this way. And that gets me to my first slide. This is a poster that I have on my office wall. I've had it up since the year 2000. I bought it because I thought it might inspire me in some way. I came from a union family. At the time, I was a member of a union, and I soon became my union president at that particular job at the Economic Policy Institute, Teresa's favorite organization. And this slogan, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, was a phrase coined by Robert Owen, the famous utopian socialist in the early part of the 19th century, as a rallying cry for the early labor movement. This idea that you could go to work for 8 hours and then you could sleep for 8 hours. And I particularly love this triptych because it's a woman, it's a textile worker who's a woman working in some factory. She's toiling away at some, it looks like a loom or something there, I'm not quite sure. Then she gets to sleep and there's a little mouse there. And then she gets to spend her 8 hours hanging out on a boat, reading her union her union advocate with her beau, right? That sounds like an awesome life, right? 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will. And this was the rallying cry for the union movement for over a century. But I also kind of giggle every time I look at this because there's so much missing from this particular triptych. In my book, I call this what's missing is the silent partner of American capitalism. There's all this work that is done every day that isn't actually here. It's not even visible. Because for this woman to spend 8 hours at work, 8 hours sleeping, and 8 hours hanging out on a boat, there has to be somebody behind her who is actually preparing her breakfast and lunch so that she has something to eat while she's at work, somebody who's washing those sheets and dusting and obviously needs to be working on the mousetrap, but somebody who's like doing that housework. And then somebody who's probably taking care of the kids or the ailing family members while she's out on the boat. So there's a lot of hidden labor, probably unpaid labor at the, given the time that this idea came out, that is behind, that made this possible, that made the ability for us to have the fight for the 8-hour day for every worker sort of the rallying cry. And we don't see it because it's unpaid. And of course, over the years, lots of different kinds of economists have noticed that there was unpaid labor in the home and that we need to find ways to make that visible. And this is a shout out to somebody who I know will probably eventually watch this video. I know there at least one person will, who is still an activist thinking about how we can bring in unpaid labor into our national income and product accounts. How can we value the unpaid labor that's done in the home? And that was a rallying cry for feminists in especially the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. It was an early thing that we talked about in the founding of IAFI. But I want to argue something different today, which is that I think that we need to rethink more than just making that unpaid work visible. We need to sort of figure out what it means that this unpaid work is obscured, but it's obscured in particular ways now that are very different than when this triptych, almost 200 years ago, when the ideas behind it were first thought of. And I want to talk about the stress that this creates inside families today. So, I had a lot of fun with PowerPoint this morning, so there's a lot of interactive graphics, so hopefully you all will be excited about that. So first data point here that I want to turn to, which is that when you look out in the United States today, and you look at families at the bottom of the income distribution, in the middle of the income distribution, and the top, professional families, you find this commonality, which is that there are very few families that have that silent partner still at home. About a quarter of families across the income distribution have a full-time stay-at-home caregiver. And that's only, these numbers are for families that have a child under the age of 14 at home. So this is families with little kids and school-age children. So presumably families that don't have small children actually have fewer stay-at-home caregivers. So this is sort of an upper bound. So only about a quarter of families actually have that stay-at-home caregiver. And that's the same no matter where you sit in the income distribution. So there's some consistency that everybody's feeling this stress because they have their 8 hours at work and they want to have their 8 hours of sleep, but what they will is a lot of bickering and frustration over all of this work that needs to happen. You see a lot of families outsourcing a lot of that work, buying prepared foods, maybe getting somebody to come and mow the lawn for them, outsourcing childcare or elder care, lots of this going on, which costs a lot of money. But even those low-income families are struggling. They don't have that full-time stay-at-home caregiver. Now, this is, of course, very different than what it looked like in 1960. And I would argue, and I don't have data going back, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that 1930s and maybe the early part of the 20th century looked a lot more like 1960 than today. From all the evidence we have, that's true. When you look across the income distribution back in 1960, most families had a full-time stay-at-home caregiver. and it didn't matter where you sat on the income spectrum. Now, it's true that if you're a professional family, that lighter bar, you're more likely to have a stay-at-home caregiver, but it's also true if you're a low-income family, about 60% had that full-time stay-at-home caregiver. So when you think back to that triptych, they had somebody at home that could allow the worker to go out and spend 8 hours of a day at work and still have some relaxation time because there was somebody at home doing that hidden labor. That is not true for today's families. And while I don't at all want to disparage the enormous accomplishment that was the set of policies that we implemented as a part of the New Deal, in my talk, I want to make an argument that we need to rethink the boundaries that those sets of policies created around how we buy and sell time. They don't make sense anymore for today's families. They were created at a time when families looked very different than they do today. And I'm specifically speaking about the three sets of the three laws, one set, three actual laws, that still today govern time use. So one is the Social Security Act, which provides income support for people when they can't work. And in the Social Security Act, that's either because you're either unemployed or you're old, and then later on we added disability. But for the most part, it's about people who are exiting the labor force or who've been pushed out of the labor force and providing some income support when for some reason you can't work, but it has this sort of either permanence or it's not your fault. You've been unemployed through no fault of your own. The second bit of legislation is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which provides rules around overwork. That's the law that brought us the 8-hour day for those of us who are covered by it. If you're a salaried worker, probably not, but that's a different lecture. But so the Fair Labor Standards Act brought us the 8-hour day, it brought us the minimum wage, and it outlawed child labor. So, and this is still the only law that governs working hours that we have here in the United States at a federal level. And then third is, I would put into this mix the National Labor Relations Act, which makes it possible for workers to form unions and have the right to collectively bargain. And most union contracts cover working time. That's one of the most important things that they focus on, that and wages, of course. But working time is something that, as we've seen this decline in unions, I think we're missing that there's no longer that entity out there, unions, in most workplaces to help people navigate time use. And we don't have laws that actually help them do it. So we have these set of policies that for the most part presume this silent partner at home, although that no longer exists for most families. So a second wrinkle, a second big change that we've seen. If you look back at 1960, most families with children, same sample, families with children under the age of 15 at home, looking across low-income, middle-class, and professional families, most families had one breadwinner, one breadwinner. So be you a low-income family, a middle-class family, professional family, you had one person out there earning the living, right? One. So you could have these conversations about something called a family wage. And I remember reading about that in graduate school. And I also remember just being so befuddled by this whole idea of a family wage because it made no sense to me. It still makes no sense to me. It makes a lot of sense if you have one worker, you can kind of conceptualize a family wage. Well, that's like the wage you support a family because you have one person out there. That is, of course, not what things look like today. And they look very different depending on where you sit on the income distribution. If you're a low-income family, you still most likely have one earner, and that's because you have one adult. So you don't have anybody at home, you just got one person, and that person's doing everything. That person is probably really stressed out. And as you go up the income distribution, you have more families having two earners. So that creates sort of two problems. One, you have these families that increasingly have just one adult who had that person in the labor market, and they don't have any time at home, but they also don't have any income. And they're now living in a world where most families have multiple earners, so they're competing in housing markets and for goods and so all these things on one income, and everybody else has two incomes, so they can buy more stuff because they've got more income. So you've got these two sort of twin problems here. There's a couple of other problems or challenges that this poses, particularly for policymakers. Of course, I work in DC, so I think about policy all the time, try to advise policymakers. And one of the things, and I had another slide here that I took out because I didn't want to overwhelm people, but when you think about this transition from one breadwinner to multiple breadwinner, it's because we've seen these really remarkable changes inside families. It used to be, and when Frances Perkins, who was, of course, the first cabinet secretary and the person who was the architect of the three policies I listed, the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the National Labor Relations Act, when she was the Secretary of Labor, she knew what a family looked like. So she could make a policy knowing that it would support families because she actually kind of had a sense of what they look like. They were a male breadwinner in this family. Now, if you're a policymaker, you can't just have a policy that supports families because there's a much wider array in diversity in family types. Everything from greater single-parent families, differences in how multi-generational families look today, and a host of other issues alongside this move from some families having one earner to two earners. It makes it much more complicated to think about one set of policies. It also underscores that in order to do good policy or to think about the implications, you actually have to take a deeper dive and look at what's actually happening inside families in ways that you might not have had to before, because families look differently based on where they sit on the income distribution. So I want to shift gears a little bit now, and I want to talk about how it is that we got here. Why are we now living in this world where we have these changes in how families support themselves? Why is it that families have lost this time? Why are they selling so much more time into the labor market? And it sort of starts with the motivating question, which is I started by saying I'm really interested in basically family incomes. And then because I was interested in incomes, I started talking about time because essentially we sell our time to get our income. So I had to think about that. Let me step back and look at income again. And I'm going to take you to the Pacific Northwest. So I grew up in the Seattle area, and this is a picture. So if you don't know anything about Washington State, we have a row of mountains going through the state, and they're beautiful mountains, the Cascade Mountain Range, and this was one of the most beautiful mountains in all the Cascade Range up until 1980. This is Mount St. Helens, which is this perfect, beautiful peak that goes straight up into the sky on the one side and comes down the other, and was just, this gorgeous mountain. And then, of course, something quite remarkable happened, again, around 1980. This actually was in 1980, which is the top of that mountain blew right off. And it no longer has that perfect peak. Now it's just this big sort of pile of, it's no longer so steamy, but this pile of steam, and there was a lot of mud, people got stuck in it, just sort of the top just blew off. Because there were these, of course, these shifts in these tectonic plates under the earth, and I'm not a geologist, this is like the end of my knowledge on that, but that made this mountain blow up. But it changed things forever for people that lived around there, and it changed the face of what this mountain looked like. And I'm now going to show you a chart that for years has made me think of Mount St. Helens, and I finally had a reason to put these together, so I was very excited about that. So this is a chart of family income and U.S. productivity growth. So it's the growth in family income and the growth in U.S. productivity from 1979, and we're going to go all the way to 2013. As you can see in the first part of the chart, family income growth and productivity are growing side by side. And they look like that first picture of Mount St. Helens. They're both going straight up into the sky. It's just this really nice, heading towards this peak. It's awesome. It's beautiful. And they're marching hand in hand, side by side. Then, in about 1980, something happens. And one line continues to look like that climb up the mountain, and the other one looks like post-eruption Mount St. Helens, with a big old pile of muck there in the middle and a flattened top. So the top green line is the growth in U.S. productivity. And you guys are economists, so you know that by productivity growth, I mean the amount of stuff per hour that the U.S. economy is creating. And the bottom line is the growth in U.S. family incomes. So one thing that we've seen over this time period that families have put in more time into the labor market is that their incomes have not kept pace with the growth of the wealth of our nation overall. So one reason that people might be working more is that they're feeling this squeeze. They're not getting as much in terms of their earnings, and so they're trying to overcome that. They're trying to cope with that by actually trying to put more people into the labor market to cope with the fact that their incomes are falling. Of course, this chart is this is the median family income. This is taking into account the fact that people are actually working more than they were in the 1960s and 70s. So it's sort of, once you look at that, you can see why people might be feeling a little anxious, a little stressed, putting in more time, but we look like post-eruption Mount St. Helens when in fact America is getting richer and richer and American families aren't. So the second trend, and the last time I spoke at the New School, I had the distinct honor of getting to speak with Thomas Piketty, so I just thought I would throw a Piketty chart up here. This is from Piketty and Sias's now famous QJE article that they update regularly, and we work a lot with them on distributing that, showing the gains of the income gains going to tax filers from 1979 to 2007, so the year before the crisis. And of course, what you can see is that the top 1% has received about 60% of the total gains, while the bottom 90% has received 8.6. So this is another thing that's been going on. It's not just that productivity and income, median income, has been moving apart. It's that there's been this pulling apart in America. Some people are getting richer, and most of us, quite frankly, are not. So going back to those three income groups I showed in the earlier charts, low-income families, middle-class families, and professional families, and just one brief sort of side note, I define professional families as families in the top 20% of income where somebody has a college degree. So it's not just the family where you have someone who's making a lot, maybe a small business owner, but doesn't have a college degree, isn't in the professionals. But you have to be in the top 20%, have a professional degree. About, depending on the year, it's around 13%. Low-income families are the bottom third, and the middle is everyone else in between. But this just shows you the percent change in family income from 1979 and 2013 for the top, the middle, and the bottom. And you can see quite clearly that low-income families they're losing. They've lost 2% of income. Middle-income families have gained about 12%. And those folks at the top are getting all of the income gains. They've increased their incomes by about 50%. But it turns out that this story, right, so the story that I've just told about the gap between income and productivity, the inequality story, these are stories about income, right? And so this is a story that we hear a lot. It's about the income squeeze. And we talk about this in the popular discourse, and economists talk about it. Oh, we've got this rise in inequality. It's an income squeeze. But I want to go back to why we're talking about time today. So the data analysis that I did for the book, and we are actually actively updating it as I speak. So this is actually updated, new year of data since the book. I looked at how much of those changes in income between 1979 and today, so this is through 2013, so not quite today, but almost, how much was due to the added hours of women, the added earnings that women have gained, mostly due to their added hours, but also because women have increased their educational attainment and experience markedly over this period. How much is due to the change in men's earnings, not disaggregated based on hours and earnings, but just total men's earnings? And then how much is due to other? And that's what this chart shows. And so I've put a little red, I told you I had fun with the PowerPoint. So the red box around the middle income, so let's start there. What that shows is that men's earnings in middle-class families between 1979 and 2013 actually dragged family income down. Had it not been for the added hours and earnings of women, family income would have fallen, all else equal. Now, granted, these are just shift share analysis at the end of the time period, so this is not looking at causality or anything, but it's just saying, given what happened, had women not increased their hours, what would have happened to family income? And it would have fallen because men's earnings fell and because other is a very small share. When you look at low-income families, the story is even grimmer because men's earnings have fallen even more. And while women's added earnings have risen, they haven't risen enough to overcome the decline that low-income families have seen in male earnings. And then, of course, looking at professional families, women's hours and earnings have have almost doubled the amount of gains that professional families have seen. So while some of this is because of the rising inequality among men and men's earnings have continued to rise, a lot of what's been going on at the top is due to the added hours and earnings of women. And so those dual earning families that have two highly paid professionals are really pulling apart. And it is because of this added work. And so the The nugget here is that while we talk a lot about an income squeeze, we talk about rising inequality, we talk about economic anxiety, I actually think that what's going on in American families isn't just anxiety around income, it's that families have coped with the decline in income and with the economic anxiety by working more, not just wanting to work more, but actually working more. And that causes a lot of stress and anxiety because they're doing so in a world that is made for that triptych I showed you back in slide number 2, where there's this imaginary, at the time not imaginary, but a real silent partner to take care of all of the things that you need to do in life so that families can actually focus on their day job. Now you have that unpaid hidden labor is not only hidden, it's actually, it doesn't happen anymore, right? There's actually no one left to do it. So we've pushed out the boundary of how much we've outsourced or commodified what's happened in the home as a way of dealing with economic anxiety, but we haven't dealt with the fundamental anxiety over time. And I would just like to posit, I think this may be a personal thing, but it seems to me that time is really important. It's important to me. I think it's important to a lot of people, like how you're spending it. Are you feeling rushed? Are you feeling stressed? Are you feeling like you have enough time for your kid? And while there's a lot of things that you can outsource picking up the prepared salad. You can outsource, somebody coming in to clean your home and maybe clean up the kitchen so you can come home from work and take the salad out of the bag and put it in the bowl and you don't have to actually do much of that labor. But what you cannot outsource is the conversation that you're going to have with your family over dinner. That time is actually what creates the relationships in your family, right? You can't outsource that. You can't not do that. And that's what we hear people struggling about over. That's like, I think, the root of, in my view, a lot of the anxiety that we hear people talking about. Fundamentally, it's about not having enough money and needing to work more, but people experience it as a time crunch. So I would recommend that we deal with the time crunch. And I am not yet under a time crunch, I see, so I have time to finish my talk. It's great. It's so fun to be here and have more than like 8 minutes, so I'm really making the most of this today. So I live and work in Washington, and as I've already said, but this is my sort of, standard Econ 101 that I've been thinking about, and there's a lot of charts that sort of riff on this in the book, to explain why addressing this issue of time is so important, not just for families, but for both what happens inside families, what happens inside firms, and ultimately for our entire economy. So I try to weave it together into a story that takes this into account. So as we're buying and selling time, how is that affecting the entire economy, not just the family side? So not just like, oh, we should do this because we're nice people and we care about what happens inside families. That's important, but not just that, or not just, oh, we care about productivity, but putting it all together and making it a story about the whole economy. Because essentially what I've argued is that families are engaging very differently with the economy today than they were generations ago. Instead of having one breadwinner, they have multiple breadwinners. They have to outsource all of this work that was done in the home. So what does that do to their capacity to be able to sell time to an employer, right? It means that employers could not look out at their pool of workers and assume that there's somebody at home who can take care of a sick kid, or assume that they can have unpredictable schedules and that somebody else will be able to pick the kids up after school, so not even a sick kid, but be able to deal with all of the things that happen in life, right? They can no longer act that way, and if they do, that has impacts on productivity. Firms that don't really account for that kind of the work-life conflicts that people face tend to see higher turnover, especially if they have certain kinds of workers. It affects profitability in particular ways. I follow on Twitter the Harvard Business Review, and I feel like every single day I read yet another article about the productivity effects of in workplace policies to address work-life conflict. It also affects who can actually sell time and under what conditions. In an aging, in a country with an increased aging population, you've got more and more workers who have to care for an ailing family member. Without policies in place to help them do that, that could mean that that person has to draw back their labor supply, or maybe they drop out of the labor force entirely, with huge implications for family economic well-being, but also because now many of those workers have much more experience and talent, a loss of that productivity because you might be losing workers at sort of their peak because they can't adjudicate their work-life conflict, they can't deal with care. So So I argue in the book that we need to unpack all of this and figure out what kinds of policies we need that can help people address these conflicts between the fact that they don't have anyone at home to provide care and being able to be a good, what I call in my imagination, good worker bee. But one more pause before I go there, which is that the reason it says firm is not economy at the top is that I feel like if I've heard this once, I've heard it a gazillion times, that you hear in the narrative around how people who aren't economists think and talk about the economy. Almost always what they're talking about is essentially theory of the firm. They'll talk about what's good for the economy as though the economy were an individual small business of the kind that one could imagine in their head, like the retail store down the street or a mom and pop kind of store. And I think it's really important that we, especially as we're talking to people that aren't economists, that we make clear over and over again that a business is not actually the economy. And when we're thinking about what's good for the economy, it's not just about the short-term, immediate impact on a particular business, like, for example, if your city adopts paid sick days or something, and that makes businesses pay people to stay home when they have the flu, like that may entail a cost. But if you want to actually think about the economic effect, you have to think about the effect on families who may not be able to supply their labor if you don't provide that policy, or the long-term effects on customers and all these things by having people show up sick. And I just think it's always good to just keep reiterating this because it's a horrible myth that's out there that the economy is just a firm. So let me go over the policy recommendations. So I've laid out a set of things that we need to do to address the fact that America's silent partner is no longer at home. And they fall into 4 buckets. So one is that we need policies that address what happens when we need to be here at home, right? So there are times when somebody needs just a little bit of time at home. They don't need to drop out of the labor force entirely. They are not going to be they're not necessarily permanently disabled. It's not that they never want to come back, but maybe they need something like, 12 weeks of paid family leave, like we have here in New York. Go New York, that's awesome. That just happened yesterday. You guys all now, as of 2018, are going to have access to paid family and medical leave that will allow workers to stay home for up to 12 weeks when they need to care for a new child, care for an ailing family member, or deal with their own illness. These are the kinds of things that everybody needs, especially if you want people to come back into the labor force. Social Security, the policies in there were about people exiting or people who couldn't work because they were forced out due to unemployment. We need policies that actually make it possible for somebody to exit for a little bit and then jump right back in. Our policies aren't set up to think about how to enable work because they had the assumption of the silent partner. So that's, and then the other one I would put in that bucket is paid sick days. And that's, just shorter time. Like you just need to be home for a day or two. An urgent care issue. You got the flu, you got a bad cold, your kids got the flu. Being able to not have to go into work that day and not have to fear for losing your job. Second is that we need policies for when you need to be there at work. And in this bucket, while the Fair Labor Standards Act, fantastic piece of legislation, regulates overwork, it doesn't do anything else to regulate all the different ways that we need to be thinking about regulating time in our economy. Again, especially in a world where the vast majority, and by vast majority I mean over 9 out of 10 private sector workers are no longer represented by a union. People have no way to navigate and negotiate over their hours of work. And the fight for the 8-hour day is still a fight that we're fighting in many parts of America, but it's not just about putting a maximum limit on hours. It's about scheduling predictability. Do you know when you're going to be at work? Can you have your schedule in advance? Because if you can't actually know your schedule in advance, it makes it incredibly difficult, if nothing else, to deal with care issues. Because the child care worker, child care center, they actually need to know how many kids are going to show up this week. They can't be sort of at the whim of your boss that maybe wants you to come in tomorrow, maybe doesn't. That's like a really bad business model for them. It doesn't work for them, so they'll charge you anyway. So it kind of goes all sort of downstream there. But we have huge problems now with scheduling predictability. Second, real challenges around flexible work. Lots of workers want to be able to have some control over their schedules, especially workers that aren't necessarily working on the shop floor, although that works for them as well. But being able to say, hey, you know, could I come in an hour earlier or leave an hour earlier so I can pick up my kid after school? Or so that family members can tag team different kinds of care responsibilities. So being able to negotiate with your employer without the fear of losing your job or retaliation over your schedule and say, hey, I need a schedule that works for me, that's a right that the vast majority of American workers don't have. They have that right in Vermont and in San Francisco, and in many other countries. It's something that we could be doing. And then we also need to do something about people that have too few hours and part-time parity, sort of more long-standing issues. Third, in order to make it possible for people to get to work, we have to do something about the crisis of care. And here, and especially in the book, we all know about childcare. Like, toddlers can't care for themselves. Okay, we get it. But there's also issues around elder care, which are increasingly just as important for American workers and their families. Being able to outsource care for an ailing family member when there's nobody at home to provide care is increasingly a problem that's causing a lot of stress and anxiety for families. It's also a remarkable opportunity for gender equity, because one of the things that we see happening, at least according to survey reports, is that since most families no longer have a full-time stay-at-home caregiver, that means most men are not married to a woman who's at home, so that when his mom falls down and breaks her hip or needs some care, he doesn't have a wife who's actually at home who can go do that. So what you're seeing in the survey data is that more and more men are using time in a more gender equal way to care for their ailing parents than you actually see with men caring for children. Now, of course, the caring for children is changing over time. The millennials seem to be more gender equity, have more gender equity in time for children than older generations. But you're also seeing gender equity among care for the aging. But what we don't have are systems that make this affordable for people up and down the income ladder, or that make it really accessible. And so there's a whole bunch of policy solutions that we need focused on that. And then finally, one of the things, so we live in this world, as I've said, where the set of policies we have was crafted back in the 1930s, and for the most part crafted by Frances Perkins. Of course, there were lots of other people that helped, but she was sort of the leader inside the Roosevelt administration that made these things happen. And there's a couple of facts that we have to remember when we think about the set of policies that are the New Deal. I mean, first, Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet secretary in the United States, the only female cabinet secretary when she was the Secretary of Labor for a new agency that had been created, and she was the first Secretary of Labor. And women had only just gotten the vote a little over a decade before FDR took office. So it was new that women had any political power at all. It was also in the height of Jim Crow. And you can see the effects of the fact that women were not in workplaces, they didn't have as much political power, and we lived in a world that was very different in terms of race than we live in today. The idea that since most families look like a traditional male breadwinner, female caretaker kind of family, that Perkins could lay out a set of policy ideas that did not address the needs around care and time use. It wasn't because she didn't recognize it, and if you read her writings, and there's a fantastic biography about her by Kirsten Downey, she understood that these were really important issues, but they weren't at the top of people's minds because of the time that she lived in. But I'd like to make the argument, to sort of start ending my comments here, that part of that was also about what people deemed was fair, right? In a world where you knew what families looked like and where most families looked in a certain way, it seemed like it was fair to address the ways, to have the policies put in place that we did, because that addressed most people's problems. I would argue that today we have a set of policies that is patently unfair to anyone who has caregiving responsibilities, but is expected to behave in a labor market as though they had a silent partner at home. That is family responsibilities discrimination. And so there's sort of two axes of fairness. One, is it fair to expect people to supply their labor into a world where they have all this responsibility at home, and so they have all these hurdles and challenges that they have to get over, and we're not providing any support or help for that. But then second, are those folks being treated in the same way in the labor market? And there's a lot of evidence that they aren't, that they did those kinds of audit studies that have been done around race and gender and all sorts of other axes, have also been done around people whose resumes are exactly identical, except that one lists that they're a PTA member and the other one doesn't. And for women, but not for men, if you are identified as a mom in these audit studies, not only are you you're less likely to be offered a job, people actually hold you to a higher standard. So they expect those candidates to actually get a higher score on tests for promotions than they do people that are not identified as mothers or parents. That's a slight digression into some research evidence, but it's one that I just find particularly galling. That not only do you have this responsibility, but you actually have to work harder. Okay, that seems messed up. But if we want to address these time use issues, we have to fundamentally come to terms with what we think is fair in terms of what kinds of policies we need in order to allow people to sell time and the conditions under which we allow people to buy time in the labor market. And in a world where most people don't have a stay-at-home caregiver, it seems like it's not fair to punish those who are dealing with care in the moment. This also is really important as we're thinking about families up and down the income spectrum, because of course families at the bottom have the same challenges in terms of not having a stay-at-home caregiver that families up the income spectrum have, but they are coping with that with far fewer resources. So they can't afford to outsource as much. They can't afford the same kind of high-quality child care or elder care that families up the income spectrum can afford. And they're also doing it in a world where when employers step out and add these things on their own, they pretty much only do it for people at the top. And I have a whole series of charts that I could show you if you want in the Q&A, going through each of these policies and documenting that it is pretty much people at the top that have access, aside from government policy, but when firms do it, for policies to allow people to be here at home, for policies around scheduling predictability, for when businesses help people with their care issues, all of this is more likely to be bestowed on professional and to some extent middle-class workers than it is for folks at the bottom. Which is why we need the kinds of policy solutions that we saw enacted here in New York this week with paid family medical leave, that level the playing field so that everybody gets access to these because everybody needs them. So I will end my remarks on just a couple of political notes, because I made some comments about that at the beginning. I will note that, first off, so it took me a number of years to write this book. I started working on work-life issues, and these sets of policy issues and these questions really full force in 2005. And at the time, we were, in order to really understand what was going on, you had to look abroad. A lot of the things that I'm talking about weren't in place in the United States. The book that I have written, there is no policy that I talk about that is not in force, in place, somewhere in America today. That is a remarkable, it's still, every time I think about it, I say it sends chills down my spine, because it is a remarkable accomplishment of a set of dedicated activists and policymakers around the country that have been making social change in a political climate where nothing else is happening. So whenever you get depressed about climate change or Citizens United or name your policy issue area that's not moving forward, remember that this issue around time is where the action is. It's where people have made demonstrable progress improving people's lives because, I would argue, it's really compelling. It's compelling, it's politically potent, it transcends left and right. Democrats, Republicans, independents, men, women, everybody likes this stuff. The only people that don't like it are Chamber of Commerce's and the National Federation of Independent Businesses, as far as I can tell. But even business says they like it. There was some very interesting polling and messaging stuff released this week that got into the press that talks about just how compelling this basket of issues is, which is why it's been so successful. And so I will end on that optimistic note and in my time and pass it over to Catherine.
The time is certainly the contested terrain for American workers and the population. We do a lot of our work on the contestation over the time at retirement. The SEPA theme continues. It is my pleasure and my honor, and I'm very proud, to introduce Catherine Moose. Catherine Moose is a student in our department. She's a PhD student. She's formerly assistant in SEPA. She was awarded for her work in her classroom and also in her publications the Eberstadt Prize Fellowship for graduate students in our department. And in addition to working on her dissertation, I just found out that she is now a visiting faculty at Sarah Lawrence College, her alma mater. Her research focuses on political economy, you'll hear it in her comments, and on macroeconomics and in industrial organization, the theory of the firm. Catherine Moose's research has been published in academic journals, and in 2013, with another former SEPA assistant, Catherine Bond, co-founded the feminist blog called Lady Economist. Check it out, it's fascinating. Prior to joining the New School, she worked as a public affairs manager and policy analyst for a number of nonprofit advocacy organizations that focused on hunger, domestic poverty, and the entire U.S. social safety net. Thank you, Catherine.
Can I put this down, or should I keep it up? Is it okay? Okay. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Thank you to Teresa for that introduction. Thank you to Dr. Boushey for the terrific talk, to SEPA for organizing this event, and to the economics faculty for inviting me to respond. Dr. Boushey articulates the vision of a demand-driven economy from a feminist perspective that is attentive to the needs of families across the income distribution. By focusing on the issue of time, or lack of it, Dr. Boushey frames the discussion of work-life conflict within the realities of an increasingly unequal world where women workers make up 47% of the US labor force. This is a new understanding of the political economy of the American family, framed within the ongoing story of the development of social and labor legislation. According to some interpretations, the struggle between labor and capital is primarily over time, in particular the length of the working day. As such, Dr. Boushey's effort to find time in contemporary US society is part of the ongoing struggle between business and workers. But why does it seem that more and more US workers are losing this fight? From low-wage workers whose employers utilize just-in-time scheduling to the professional class worker who is expected to answer emails all day and night. Workers are losing this battle, and their families are paying a hefty price. Demographic, technological, and labor relations shifts have contributed to work-life conflict as we know it today. Another part of this story is the stagnation of real wages, the loss of the manufacturing base due to globalization and outsourcing, the rise of the service sector, and the decline of the American middle class. Dr. Boushey writes of the disappearance of business's silent partner, the American wife. This idea echoes the Wages for Housework campaign that began in Italy in the 1970s, which argued that women's unpaid housework and caring labor serves as the basis of the industrial economy. Another way of describing the loss of America's silent partner is that the division of labor in American society has been disrupted, and this has implications both in the workplace and in the home. As the US economy has been restructured in the neoliberal era, so has the US family. And while families are feeling this pinch, Dr. Boushey makes it clear that we shouldn't be nostalgic for the era of the male breadwinner, female caregiver model, as it was also a time when the rights of women, racial minorities, LGBT communities, and immigrants were suppressed. Dr. Boushey's vision is implicitly based on a different view of gender norms and family. Fewer US families are comprised of a heterosexual married couple, and even those that are may not conform to a traditional division of household and market work. Dr. Boushey's book reflects a feminist understanding of society that is essential to addressing the needs of contemporary US households. One of the book's primary contributions is Dr. Boushey's incorporation of a class analysis in her discussion of work-life conflict. Considering that Dr. Boushey is a New School trained economist, it is not surprising that the role of social class is central to her argument. This is refreshing because the popular press tends to focus on work-life conflict as experienced by Silicon Valley or Washington, D.C. elites. The discussion is then framed in terms of how women can better position themselves, as in Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, or how policies must change so that high-achieving women can have it all, as Anne Marie Slaughter has argued. The challenges of finding work-life balance while also breaking glass ceilings may resonate with white-collar women on a practical or an aspirational level. But for a single parent or dual-earning couple struggling to make ends meet, the problems look very different. Furthermore, in the popular media, there is little acknowledgement that the increase in working hours for professional women generally entails the increased demand for services provided by working-class women. In contrast, Dr. Boushey makes it clear that women are not a homogeneous group, and that class and race must be brought into the analysis in order to create sensible and fair policies. The middle class and working poor, as Dr. Boushey points out, is squeezed between not having enough money or time, but earning too much to qualify for government benefits that might alleviate their work-life dilemmas. While I'm in full agreement with Dr. Boushey's class analysis and the policy conclusions she draws from them, I take issue with some of the rhetoric used to soften this argument. Throughout the book, Dr. Boushey uses the phrase handout, which implies a benefit to the undeserving poor, in contrast to a help out, which implies a legitimate policy or program meant to aid working families. I interpret these phrases as acquiescence to the right-wing narrative about the welfare state. If we allow the right to hijack the debate on social policy, which they have effectively done, then we have to advocate our position on their terms. But I would argue that the real handout is given, not taken, by American workers who provide services that our economy depends on without receiving a living wage or decent benefits in return. Furthermore, these workers pay taxes, often proportionally higher than their managers, yet the US social wage doesn't provide them with adequate child care, elder care, or paid time off. Isn't this the real handout that American workers are giving to American firms? If workers are losing this fight over time, then business is winning it. Dr. Boushey discusses the so-called gig economy and how firms like Uber or TaskRabbit present new opportunities and challenges. Dr. Boushey notes that loose employment contracts or on-demand jobs may allow some workers to meet their own caregiving working responsibilities. The flexibility to take leave in the event of a sick child, for example, may make a flexible job highly desirable. However, Dr. Boushey also notes that in the gig economy, workers assume the risk of not having enough hours or enough assignments. While I'm not in disagreement with Dr. Boushey's argument, I urge considering an additional layer to the analysis. If we want to understand the implications of the gig economy, we also have to think about it from the perspective of the firm. By hiring contract workers, firms are able to keep the cost of labor down by skirting legislation like the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Family Medical Leave Act. In this sense, these gigs represent not only that there are new problems in the new economy, but also that there are old problems in the new economy, a point that Professor Jayati Ghosh of JNU has recently made. If this is true, that the real innovativeness of the app-based service sector is that tech firms have figured out how to legally rely on pre-New Deal era labor practices, then we can understand that the role of technology and its promise of flexibility is a mixed bag for workers. But what does it say about firms and their willingness to cooperate with solving work-life conflict? Dr. Boushey is right when she argues that what is in the short-term profit-seeking interests of one firm may not be in the long-term interests of American capitalism. The firm is not the economy, in other words. She's also correct to point out that efficiency wages and benefits may improve worker well-being and also boost productivity and profits. There's certainly a high road that can present a win-win scenario for employees and employers. However, taking a longer view, we can see that at different times throughout history, firms have opposed or tried to avoid labor protections in an effort to gain higher profits. From a classical theory of competition, as developed by Professor Anwar Sheikh and others, this is what we should expect from firm behavior. Driven by profits, firm will find ways to increase labor productivity while lowering labor costs, which usually means a decrease in real wages and benefits, or a race to the bottom. This is why public policy is essential. If we believe that firms will pursue their short-term interests in the search of ever higher profits, then we cannot expect them to spontaneously do the right thing for workers and their families. Dr. Boushey's story is about class society and worker struggle. She notes that declining union coverage has contributed to the vulnerability faced by many US workers. Dr. Boushey also notes the ongoing efforts of unions, partnered with advocacy and community-based organizations, to improve access to paid sick days, family leave, and fair schedules. However, I'm curious as to why throughout the book, the strength of organized labor is mourned, rather than discussed as a mechanism for easing work-life conflict. What I mean is, shouldn't bolstering organized labor be part of the solution? While policymakers do not directly control union membership, they can pass laws that strengthen or weaken collective bargaining rights. Perhaps it is not politically feasible to expect an increase in unionization in this political climate, but we cannot fight for what we do not allow ourselves to imagine. This is, of course, also true for social policy. Our efforts will only be as big or as brave as our political imagination. And on that note, I wish to congratulate Dr. Boushey on this remarkable book. I expect it will help us rewrite the rules of American capitalism for this and subsequent generations. Thank you.
Sorry.
Hello, this is the time to hear from you. Do we have any questions that I can help address the audience? Sorry? Okay. We're just asking you.
Maybe Heather just kind of
Oh, did it-
respond to Catherine's thing.
All right, so, yeah, so perhaps, why don't we take the time while I get some questions for Heather, if you'd like to respond to Catherine?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That was great. I think, well, so I was thinking about two things that you said that I think that the platform gig issue is enormously interesting, and I'm glad that you brought that up. And it certainly has blown up in terms of a policy issue over the past 3 or 4 months even. We've heard so much more about it. And how, I think that there's actually something that could be very interesting if we think that there's been this real change in how people are interacting with the economy, and we compare that with changes in how firms are doing business, it does sort of, it perhaps opens some doors to thinking about what we could do about both of them simultaneously, which is, I think, where my head is headed. How is it that we could address the rise of the gig economy, but I would broaden it at this point, which is actually different from when I wrote the book just a year ago, not just from like the gig economy, but thinking more broadly about platform firms and what it means that you have more and more workers competing, not just globally, but with these monopoly employers, basically. What does it mean for how we should be thinking about issues around antitrust and at the same time, all of which are a little scary in that they would point to workers having less power, but at the same time, there's at least right now an opening where there's some lip service because they want so many things from the state that they're talking about wanting to make sure people still get benefits, even if it's not through the employment contract. And it feels like there might be something interesting there, although perhaps not. And then on unions, the other thing I wanted to just comment on, I probably did have a mournful tone. I will accept that. And I don't actually talk in the book at all really about policy recommendations for union I mean, I say people should organize unions, and then it's not a part of the policy recommendations that I talk about. So yeah, that's important. And I do talk a lot about the advocates that have been organizing worker centers and other ways of getting at these kinds of policies around time use and how great that is. But yeah, we need more unions. Yeah.
No, just on that point, in America, we have union contracts that have just the kind of policies that you want, and it works really well.
Yeah.
The flexible schedules and the paid sick leave. So I have to ask this question because it comes from the new school. Heteromonogamy is cool.
What is that word?
It's exactly. You've been away from us too long. Well, it's a traditional male-female
Oh, okay, got it.
Parental family.
Got it.
It's cool. Thank you. But how might these policies impact, specifically, you did mention this, single-parent households, just specifically?
Yeah, I think that single-parent families are the ones that need much of this the most, and then are the ones who aren't getting it. It's really quite remarkable, and I have a paper coming out soon, I don't know if it's this week or next week, with Sarah Jane Glynn and Peter Berg. Peter's from Michigan, and Sarah Jane is at the Center for American Progress, where we look at this data from the American Time Use Survey and to analyze who has access to workplace flexibility and who has access to time off, paid time off. And, you know, ironically, of course, the people that have the least access to these kinds of workplace benefits are single parents. So we're able to pair data on workplace benefits with demographics, and nothing fancy, but just some simple probates just showing that actually the people whose family structure makes you think they would need it the most are the least likely to have it, and the people who have it the most are people who are in the highest paid jobs. So there's a real mismatch out there in terms of what's happening in the private sector, and a real need to be addressing issues around paid time off and especially schedules and care for single parents.
I'm going to ask you two questions in a row, if you can take these. This comes from someone in the audience, Jennifer Cooper from UN Women, and the other one hasn't identified themselves, but it's very hopeful, and maybe it came from one of our students. So the first one is a big macro question, world question. What's the evidence you might have that these policies actually help the economy? And the second one is about firms that may be searching for other goals besides profits, that may actually want to help their workers. This questioner is asking about Bob's Red Mill, or a supermarket change that has been in the news, seventh generation. So some of the experimentation that might be going on at the firm level. So those two questions are really different.
Oh, yeah, definitely, very different. So on the first one, it's an easy answer, which is that the whole second half of the book is just basically economic evidence. Hi, Jen, nice to see you. Thank you for coming. But yeah, I mean, everything from citing a number of macroeconomic studies that show, I've done some work in this area with John Schmidt and Eileen Applebaum, but more importantly, quite frankly, the IMF has done work showing that that added women's labor supply in the United States has improved U.S. output in demonstrable ways. We estimate that U.S. GDP is 11 percentage points higher, or 11%, I can't quite remember, than it would have been otherwise. That's a big difference. I think it's 11%. There's also a lot of micro evidence about the implementation of these policies, both at the firm level, but also at the policy level. The nice thing about having all these policies, having it in place somewhere in America, is that you actually have evidence in most of these places. So we now know a lot about paid family medical leave from the fact that California implemented it in the early 2000s and New Jersey. So we have analyses of those two states that show that while a lot of businesses claim that it would destroy life as they knew it, and actually in the chapter, I start off the chapter, I talk about that with a quote from a small business owner who said, if you implement paid family leave in California, like my business is going to go under and it's going to be so bad and all of this. And then, as it turns out, because that was a long time ago, he actually successfully sold his business to another small business owner, another small restaurant owner 7 years later. So his business not only didn't go under, but it was really successful, and then he sold it to somebody else who also didn't go under. So you have a lot of evidence like that, but a lot of evidence that after they're implemented in California, 90% of firms say that paid family leave was positive or had no impact on their business. So only 10% had any negative outcomes at all. So, and that's just on the paid leave. We, of course, know a lot about schedules, and there is, evidence just miles high on the importance of especially early childhood education on kids. And I talk a lot about how that is, what we also know about that is that it's about the quality of the worker. So care for children and elders, the quality of that care is entirely conditional on the quality of the people that are providing that care, because it's a human service. And so that also makes the argument for paying those people well. And now I'll stop, because I could go on for a really long time. So there's a lot of evidence, both at the macro level, but also at the micro level. And then the other question on firms that have that are sort of, I didn't quite understand it. So thinking about.
There's some good firms that care about, it's not Ben and Jerry's, but
Yeah.
Ben and Jerry's like, what kinds of firms are doing it? Maybe Bucking Shakes, real competition.
Yeah. Well, so I'll say two things on that. There are a lot of great firms out there that do this, and in the chapter that I have on hours, I talk more about firms and in other chapters, because a lot of firms have done things around scheduling predictability or flexibility for their employees, and businesses do it because it's good for business. So you see a lot of firms who have these great business models, and it's always interesting, like why. I tell a story from Nick Bloom, who's an economist at Stanford, has been studying flexibility from a management perspective, and I quote him saying he doesn't understand why every firm doesn't just implement workplace flexibility, because it's such an effective management strategy, which is nice to have a Stanford business school professor say that, so you can cite him. But he cites this story about JetBlue that has a really flexible employment, flexible workplace model, because their headquarters are in Salt Lake City, and so they were able to tap into a stay-at-home workforce that they wouldn't have been, a highly educated workforce, but a lot of women who don't necessarily want to go into work every day, who are dealing with a lot of care and work issues, but how good that's been for business. But I will say something a little less positive on that, which is that a lot of times when firms do this, they only do it for some workers. So in the past year, Netflix famously offered paid family medical leave to its employees. But it turned out it was only to some of their employees. And the people that actually put your CD in the pocket, that person who puts the CD in the little envelope and then in the envelope and into the mail to send it to you, that person does not get paid family medical leave. It's like some other people that get it. And I think they might have changed that because they were under a lot of pressure to do so. Or Starbucks, which famously, after the Judy Cantor story in the New York Times about their horrible just-in-time scheduling practices, they changed their policy the next day after the Times story ran, but then 6 months later, people are still saying, yeah, not so much. So there are these good stories, but there's a lot of, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be just stories, right?
Yeah.
So here are two very related questions, and both, I think, from students. One is from Samantha Coco Klein, a Milano PhD student. She talks about a recent New York Times article showing what we all know, that when women enter a field, wages drop.
yeah.
And is this caused by sex discrimination, gender discrimination? And is that helping drive the gap between family income and productivity? And then somebody else asked that often fairness and social norms are very much are formed and undermined by racism. So in what way does racism affect your story, and also discrimination and the fact that employers seem to use women to lower the wages of men?
Yeah, these are tough questions. So the story about women entering, wages dropping is, it's good to see this getting attention. It certainly happened before. It's not only the case often that wages drop once women take over occupations, but you see that when women are trying to enter new, especially professional occupations, somehow the hours requirements start rising as more women start entering. Everything gets kind of the time requirement gets ramped up. So you're kind of like, that's also a form of the same phenomena. Very frustrating. Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know what else to say about that, except that it's really frustrating, and it shouldn't it's bad. It's very bad. It shouldn't happen. But is it driving the gap between income and productivity, I think, is a really interesting question, because I have not seen any studies that have looked at that specifically. One study that might speak to this a little bit is a study by Peter Klenow and 3 other authors. Peter's also a Stanford professor, and a couple of folks at the University of Chicago did this study a number of years ago where they found that looking at economic growth between 1960 and 2008, so looking at U.S. economic growth over this very long time period, they found that between 16 and 20% of U.S. economic growth was because of the opening up of professions to women and minorities. So because of the civil rights era that allowed women and minorities to enter this wider range of occupations, if you think that talent is anything like normally distributed, not allowing women and people of color to enter these occupations was denying the economy of all of this talent, which was the argument that they were making. And they found that actually that was true. Whether or not you're able to pay that talent less, though, is a real, speaks to the importance of unions and organizing and power, but it also does probably lend a little bit of credibility to the notion that it is part of this gap between income and productivity. Moving on to the fairness and racism point, I don't think it can be said enough that certain kinds of workers are given the opportunity to have policies that allow them to address their time conflicts, and certain others aren't. And one of the most evocative set of studies that's now been put into a book is by Naomi Gertzel and her colleague, whose name I am blanking on, sociologist at UMass. I can see him in my head, but Dan Clausen. So Naomi and Dan Clausen have written a series of papers that turn into a book about looking inside a hospital, where they look at the different ways that different workers inside the hospital deal with time use. And so it's a very sort of qualitative, in-depth, with some quantitative work in it. And of course, the surgeons and the doctors tend to be white men. They look at 4 different categories of workers: nurses, and then they have the orderlies and the janitors. And so as you go down, the people get more of color, and they get paid less, and they are more likely to be women, although you've got a lot of men in the janitorial. And they talk about how the different power that different groups have to adjudicate their work-life challenges, and how, of course, the doctors have a lot more flexibility than the people at the bottom. They also talk a lot about how those challenges aren't seen by different groups. So, which I think is really an important piece of this, that the lower income families, the lower income workers, more likely workers of color, are more likely to rely on kin networks to help them address their work-life conflicts. Is it because they can't afford other things? Maybe. Is it because they value family more? Maybe. Maybe it's all of these things. Different studies come to different conclusions. But it does show, though, that the social networks are much more important for different families that don't have the ability to adjudicate this. But that, of course, families at the top wouldn't see that because they're able to outsource and to pay for a childcare worker. They're not trying to get their sister or their aunt to come in and cover for them when they're doing a shift or something. So it's one of the ways that I think that we see race playing out that is, it's intellectually, it's very interesting to sort of see these differences, but it does point to the need for different kinds of policies. Because if one worker is addressing these issues by relying on friends and family, do you need to be giving them more flexibility, or do you need to be giving them money to purchase more care? How is it that you're going to deal with that? But being sensitive to the social structures that are already in place that people are using is one way that I think you see race and ethnicity, immigration status also playing
That's
out.
right. I have one question for you, Heather, and then for you, Catherine. So Heather, there are 3 people here that are really wanting you to focus on one aspect, and I see them rising up. So this one comes from my colleague Nancy Fraser, who you must know in the philosophy department. She asked, can you imagine a way to reinterpret that 8-hour day for current conditions? What policies would be required, whether income support, other kinds of wages, or public provision of care services, to allow a more adequate balance for primary care responsibilities, sleeping, or for what we will. Another person says, what about that work we have to do every day, what we call in my class low schedule control?
Yeah.
The laundry, the food that has to be done. Why do they want dinner every night? We remember that cartoon. And then the third person wants you to speak to, there's a little smiley face, says it was an awesome talk, but wants to speak to whether or not policies are more effective at the local level or national level. So all really about the same thing. It's about a call to action.
Yeah. So So I'll just start with the last one, just because I wrote it down and I can see it. I don't think that the policies are more or less effective at any level. I think you can do it wherever you want. I will say, though, that given what Congress looks like, I would recommend we focus on state and local. I will say on paid family and medical leave, I think we're hitting the end of the line. There are 5 states that have had long-standing temporary disability insurance programs that were put in place in the 1950s that give, if you are a worker living in one of those 5 states, there's a statewide program where you get insurance if you become disabled. Those 5 states are California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New York, and Hawaii. And there are now 4 states that have paid family and medical leave implemented or in place, and those are California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New York, and Hawaii is a little bit different because their program isn't actually a statewide program. It's supporting private insurance. It's a little bit more complicated. And the reason that they were able to do that at those states was because there was an infrastructure that you could tap into, because setting up a social insurance program is complicated and expensive. And so whether or not other states will be able to do that, Washington State passed paid parental leave in 2007 and still hasn't implemented it because they can't afford the startup costs. I actually think that for that one, we need to go federal after New York, because we've done all we can do. We can study from it, we can learn from it, we can show what works, what doesn't, and now we need to focus on federal legislation. I was not about to advocate for specific legislation there, being the president of a 501c3. But I do think that, and then I have a couple more answers on this one. We've seen a lot of movement on paid sick days at the local level. There are now over 24 places that have paid sick days. 4 or maybe 5 states now. Who can keep track? They keep passing it. And then all these states and localities. However, a number of states have very frustratingly decided that once a city or thinks about or implements paid sick days, state legislatures have been enacting these what are called preemption laws, saying, okay, well, we understand that you at the state level or at the city level want to do this, but we're going to preempt you at the state level from actually implementing these kinds of policies. You're now seeing this start to happen with the minimum wage as well. So that there's a limit there to what we can do. I think we need federal action. And besides, we're a big country. These should be uniform rights. They should not just be rights for people who live in some states. Nancy's question about, I could go on that. I'll pause there. But because I want to get to this question about reinterpreting the 8-hour day. So I love this question, and I have a couple of ways to think about it. So one is that it seems to me, and I'm going to quote I'm going to quote Janet Gornick and mangle the way that she says it, but we basically now live in a society where most people are already caregivers and workers. So let's just be honest about that and create work days that allow people to do that. We'd move to something like a 30-hour work week where everybody would just work 30 hours, and then you wouldn't need somebody full-time at home because you'd have more time. I have doubts as to how that would go over in the United States, but it does seem like it's the only rational solution. But I do have this other set of questions, which is these 2 sets of, really just one set of questions, which is how we think about if we want to just say that everybody should be putting in 30 hours because we're assuming that everybody has, or that most families have 2 caregivers, and we no longer have this family wage. But then how we think about that in a world where you have this diverse array of families. So the slide that I stopped at, the 2 slides that I stopped at that I took out this morning because I felt like there were too many slides, show that we just have this increasingly diverse array of family types. And so if we have this diverse array of family types, we can't have these one-size-fits-all rules, right? So if we mandated a 30-hour work week, then those single parents that only got 30 hours may not have the kind of income. So I have a lot of questions. I have more questions than I do answers, but I do think this is the next frontier for what we need to be thinking about in terms of social policy. And I would encourage us all to keep thinking about it.
Yeah.
Questions for Catherine?
So Catherine, this is an empirical question, but it's also a speculative question. It's about I'll tell you, and you speculate on what it's about. So homework has become more capital intensive. So just imagine the technology in housework.
Okay.
Has become more capital intensive.
Okay.
Has that actually helped? Has it covered up this loss? Has capital solved this problem? And do you think that if you were running the numbers, would technology be available for all families at all income levels to actually mitigate this loss of the silent partner?
Well, so the empirical part is hard to address sort of off the top of my
Yeah,
head,
yeah.
although I did have a very lively debate once in the econ department around Ha-Joon Chang's book, 23 Things That They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, and one of them is the washing machine changed the world
Yes.
more than the internet. And this was a very provocative thing in this great book by Ha-Joon Chang, and he's arguing that the fact that women don't have to wash clothes by hand anymore allowed them to do other work, to get into the workforce, and that female labor force participation, Heather's talk, all of this is partially due to the washing machine, among other technology. And I sided with Ha-Joon Chang because he's one of my favorite economists, but another economist in the department said, well, actually, women's time use hasn't gone down. Their hours that they spend in housework and care work has not gone down since this new technology has been introduced. And so that's where it becomes really difficult to tease out what is the effect of this technology, right? Things like washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. So that's part of the empirical question, which is still something we debate in the econ department. The other side of it was, does everyone have the technology?
Yeah, speculate about the distribution of this helpful technology.
Yeah, I mean, first it matters, is the technology helpful?
Yeah,
Right? I mean,
right.
does it really reduce your hours of, I mean, certainly to have things like running water changes everything, right? If we think about typical U.S. society, even low-income families that have a refrigerator and electricity and these things that are out of reach in a lot of other societies and countries, then of course. But I still think that the question of time is not only cannot only be solved by technology, right? The technology is also causing more time crunch, right? I mean, one of the things we talked about is the employers expect more from workers. So maybe someone is cooking dinner but also answering emails at the same time. I mean, this is the new reality. So I don't know if that fully answered.
No, I thought that was a good way to go approach it. As many feminists said, the washing machine just made people have 7 pairs of pants and not 2 dirty ones.
Right.
That you have more clothes and they're cleaner, but it doesn't help with the work. We have questions, Heather, if you want to speculate on. I won't read from them, but more about this, the famous gap, the famous, Mount Helens, where not only the average wage, has separated from productivity, but the average family income is also separated from productivity. So imagine the silent partner still, the unpaid labor still in the household. Do you expect that sort of productivity would have kept up with wages? Or was there something about that silent partner coming into the labor force has pulled down wages, or has actually caused more profits? I mean, what is you've given us the data on it, but what is the causal mechanism for the silent partner being lost and family income and the productivity gap existing and growing?
Yeah, so so the way that let me just sort of walk back through my logic here, because I think that I typically, so that figure, I think what is so remarkable about it is that has happened even though people are putting in more time.
Yes.
So that's family income, it's not wages. So you see the same figure, it looks different, but the same essential figure when you look at wages and productivity, as you do with family income and productivity, even though you've got typically more people actually out there working. And we know that there's a lot of reasons why this is the case. A lot of reasons why there's this growing gap, certainly the decline of unions, the decline in worker bargaining power more generally, the way that we've seen increased international competition. There's really great new papers out that are blaming, that are focusing on the openness to China and what that's done to wages in particular communities. So there are all of these other things happening at the same time. So I actually don't know that it's all about, I certainly don't think it's all about gender or labor supply, why we see that growing gap. But on the other hand, I mean, so as you've seen women go into the labor market, you've seen them see these very sharp increases in wages associated with their growth in earnings and experience, while you've seen male wages stagnant for, virtually, since the mid-1970s. So the fundamental question there is, so essentially what you're asking is really, did male wages stagnate or be flat because of this entry of women into the labor market? And because so often they're actually not directly competing, but they are working in different kinds of occupations. So the extent to which men are leaving something, is it that those men are being paid less, or is it that they are leaving these less paid occupations? I think you certainly see that at the bottom part of the labor market, but I don't think you see that at the top, where men's pay has been still quite dynamic.
So we have time for one more question, and then discussion among yourselves, or something you would want to bring up, especially from Catherine. This is a question actually about different kinds of firm organization, either the C corporation or even workers' cooperatives. Do those differently formed corporations have different kind of work-life balance policies?
So I'm smiling because one of my, a study that I just love by Claudia Golden that came out a number of years ago, she did this really interesting work looking at issues around schedules, and found that women professionals, only professionals I'm talking about, were choosing different kinds of firms to work for than men. And they were doing it because the example that she said, which is not the whole story, but the one that stuck in my mind, was that, so if you become a doctor, or let's say you become an obstetrician, right, a very highly paid specialty, if you're a man and you become an obstetrician, you still go out and you hang out your shingle. You become like your own small business, and then you just work wherever you need to, and that's what you do. And you probably still, you have your wife, you do whatever you do. But women who become obstetricians are much more likely to go in and join a hospital or an HMO, where the pay might be a little bit lower and they may have a little bit less freedom, but they have colleagues who can cover for them, so that they aren't just hanging out there on their own. And it was such an evocative study, and she argued in that paper and subsequently that the next frontier around gender equity is about dealing with schedules, and but it has to do with this corporate form that you're talking about. I mean, it's related, but it's the one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And we don't have enough evidence on worker cooperatives.
I have not seen enough evidence on worker cooperatives.
Catherine, any closing comments?
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about just now, and which is in the book, is that these aren't just women's issues, right? These are economic issues, and how to sort of reframe them in people's minds to understand that this is one of the big stories of the U.S. economy in the 20th century and now the 21st, and how we can really take it seriously on that level. So.
And Heather, any closing comments?
I loved Catherine's closing comment.
I thought you would.
Yeah, no, I mean, I loved it especially because we talked a little bit beforehand, but part of the frustration that led me to write the book was just getting really tired of seeing these issues only on the style pages, when in fact they belong on the business page. And also just frustrated that nobody had actually written a book about the economic argument for this really important battle over time, which is so fundamental to labor. So I echo that. But I also think that's actually why I always end by pointing to the enormous political salience of this, which is that they aren't just women's issues. And that's why so many people find them so compelling, because women have changed how they spend their days. Okay, so that's maybe the catalyst. It's a women's issue. Maybe it's because of feminism. Maybe it's because men's earnings have fallen. Quite frankly, it's a little bit of both. So women have changed what they do, but that has changed life for everybody. It's changed life for the elderly that aren't being cared for for children, for their husbands or partners. And so it's a really, it's like we get so lost in the fact that thinking this is about women that we forget that this is actually about families, which is, yeah.
One point, and let that be a lesson to you all, students. Maybe you'll stay a bit and talk to some
Oh, yeah.
of our students. Thank you very much for coming.